Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. And this is Brazil Unfiltered. Brazil Unfiltered is a program designed to explain Brazil to those who know something about the country and want to learn more. After living in Brazil for over a decade, working for human rights in the country for more than 40 years, and teaching Brazilian history to bright, young brown students who come into the classroom knowing very little about the country, its people, and its culture, I've thought a lot about how to communicate my knowledge and analysis of Brazil's complexities to people curious to learn more. So today we're launching our third season. I'll be broadcasting from my home in Providence, Rhode Island, directly to you. I have new producers working with me on the show, and the program will be on YouTube as well as podcast. If you would like to get in contact with me, you can send an email to brazilunfiltered@gmail.com. So what's going on in Brazil right now? It's a very complex situation. We're going to have a lot of fun unpacking it and trying to make sense of it. You probably know about Jair Bolsonaro, the right-wing former army captain and COVID-19 denier, who was elected to the presidency of Brazil in October of 2018. He was elected in a runoff with Fernando Haddad, a lawyer, university professor, and former mayor of the city of São Paulo, and the former minister of education under the government of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, commonly known as Lula. Bolsonaro won about 55% of the votes and Haddad 45%. So soon after Bolsonaro was elected, he was called by journalists in the United States the Trump of the tropics. And the reasons are because he seemed very familiar to something that people in the United States had already experienced for 2 years, namely Donald Trump. Bolsonaro is homophobic, he's a misogynist, he doesn't like indigenous peoples, he's against the legalization of indigenous lands. He is totally against any environmental protections. He wants to open the Amazon rainforest to mining interests and agro-business, cattle interests in the country. He's very much pro-arms and against any kind of gun control. In fact, uses the gun sign as a way of signaling to his supporters his feeling about this question. He's had massive support of evangelical Christians who are growing in Brazil as a political force. And he supports the neoliberal economic policies of Paulo Guedes, the Ministry of the Economy, which is basically privatizing state-owned companies and opening the country to further foreign investment. So in other programs, we're going to go into much more detail about Bolsonaro, and we'll talk more about his politics, his programs, and his perspectives. So in October, there was a big demonstration calling for the impeachment of Bolsonaro, with 20 political parties supporting the first major demonstration throughout the country and internationally, including a demonstration outside of Brown's Gate by graduates organized by Brazilian graduate students. So if we think of Trump as a way to understand Brazil, the analogy holds true for many reasons. First of all, the United States has reached 700,000 COVID deaths, and Brazil has reached 600,000. There are over 500 people dying a day. Bolsonaro, like Trump, denies the danger of COVID-19. He, like Trump, provides ideas of alternative medicines and cures for the virus. The economic crisis in Brazil has gotten deeper and deeper. There's tremendous inflation. There have been droughts that have caused shortages of water, which is the main way to produce energy in Brazil. So there's been an energy crisis looming. There is even now, the first time, major dust storms in the state of São Paulo and the state of Minas Gerais because of the drought, because of the dry lands in the outlying regions of these states. Bolsonaro has allowed for there to be an increased deforestation of the Amazon and basically has alienated large sectors of society, including many people supported him. So if he had 55% of the population voting for him in 2018, his poll numbers have dropped to 20 to 25%. Many people just don't like what he's done. When I was in Brazil during the elections, I would talk to taxi cab drivers and Uber drivers about who they were supporting. And they would confess that they were voting for Bolsonaro, which was very depressing for me. I moderated my comments with them. But then after the election victory, I would say to them, look, do me a favor. You think he's going to be a great president. He's going to be a horrible president. He's going to be the worst president in the history of Brazil. So write down on a piece of paper who you voted for, because I guarantee in 2 years, you're going to forget that you voted for Bolsonaro. And sure enough, millions of people now are denying that they ever voted for him. I can't remember who they voted for and are claiming that they didn't even vote because they're so embarrassed about how bad he has been as a president. So what's the context for what's going on in Brazil? And the big thing that's looming on the horizon are the 22 elections. The first presidential election will be on October 2nd. That's when also there'll be election for the entire Congress, senators, and governors. And in Brazil, if one candidate for the president doesn't get a majority in the vote, there's a runoff. And because there'll probably be about 10 or so presidential candidates, it's quite likely, although not guaranteed, that there will be a runoff between the two top vote getters. And so who are the main candidates? Well, at the top of the list now is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. He was a former trade union leader. He ran for president 4 times in 1989, 1994, 1998, and 2002, and was elected in 2002. He then was reelected in 2006. And when he left office in 2010, he had 80% popularity. He was able to handpick his successor, Dilma Rousseff, who was elected in 2010 and served and was reelected in 2014 and then impeached in 2016. Lula is immensely popular with large sectors of the population because of the social programs that he carried out and his ability to talk to the people and speak in their language. In order to prevent him from being in the 2018 elections, because the polls indicated he would win, he was charged with corruption. He was convicted. He was sentenced to time in prison and served 580 days in prison. Instead of asking for political asylum or leaving the country, he stayed there. He contested the charges against him. And in fact, after getting out of prison, the Supreme Court ruled that most of the charges against him were improperly carried out, that the judge who was overseeing the case was biased and was actually in collusion with the prosecuting attorney. And since then, all of the charges of corruption against him have been dropped for either procedural or factual reasons. And as a result of that, he's remaining extremely popular. The most recent polls from Datafolha, which is the most respected poll company doing polls in Brazil, gives him 45% of the votes against Bolsonaro with 25%. And some polls indicate he might even win in the first round. In the second round, according to Datafolha, Lula wins with 56% of the votes against Bolsonaro with 31%. So at this point, Lula is likely to be the next president. But anyone who knows anything about Brazil knows that anything can happen. And so the next year, between now and the elections in 2022, many, many things are going to happen and things are going to change. And so I'm going to hold back on any predictions about the inevitability of Lula's victory at this point. So this has caused a big crisis because the traditional economic and other elites of the country supported Bolsonaro. Some of them have distanced themselves from Bolsonaro's policies because he's been so unpopular and so incapable of addressing the COVID-19 crisis, the economic crisis, and other problems. And so they're very concerned that, in fact, the elections might be against Lula and Bolsonaro, and Lula will win. And so they've been promoting what they call a third way, an alternative center-right candidate. And their minds will eliminate the polarization, the alleged polarization between Bolsonaro and Lula, arguing that Bolsonaro is an extremist on the right and Lula is an extremist on the left. And again, we'll talk more about Lula in another program in which we'll clarify that false charge against Lula's alleged extremism. So what is this third way? Okay, so to understand Brazil, the country has 33 legal political parties, of which 24 are in Congress. And it's a huge complexity to understand the dynamics of these political parties. The main group in Congress, which is to the center right, is called the Big Center, the Centrão, and they have supported Bolsonaro. In supporting Bolsonaro, they get appointments to ministries from their political parties. They get certain benefits by getting special legislation passed to benefit their constituencies. And so even though some of them have started to step away from Bolsonaro, or their political parties have stepped away from Bolsonaro, he still is getting their allegiance. And so over 100 impeachment requests against Bolsonaro have stalled in Congress because they're not ready yet to break with him definitively. On the other hand, they're very nervous that if Bolsonaro is the candidate of the center-right in the elections, Lula is going to win. And so the major media sources, which are generally very conservative, have started talking about this third way. So the problem they have is that in the polling, none of the candidates of the third wave gets more than 6 to 8% of the votes in the elections. And so if it remains divided and polarized between Lula and Bolsonaro, then they have no chance of winning. So who are the main candidates of this third wave? The first is a bloc represented by the Brazilian Social Democracy Party. They ruled under Fernando Henrique Cardoso for 2 terms before Lula became president. They have important politicians in major states around the country, and especially they have tremendous influence in the state of São Paulo, which is the center of the economic engine of the country. And I just want to warn you, don't get fooled by names of political parties in Brazil, because their names don't necessarily reflect on what they really believe. In fact, with few exceptions of the parties of the left, their names have nothing to do with their ideas or ideology. So who are the 2 main candidates of the Brazilian Social Democracy Party? One is João Doria, who is the current governor of São Paulo, who is not very popular in the state. And the other is Eduardo Leite, the governor of the state in the south of Brazil called Rio Grande do Sul. He recently came out as gay. He is very conservative in his political policies and his economic policies, not very popular in the state, and would unlikely be reelected were he to run again. He is challenging Doria, who has control over the political party, and there will be a contested primary later this year about who will actually be the candidate of the PSDB. But still, neither of them is polling more than 6 or 7 points. Doria is getting 8 percentage points in the polls, and Leite is not even showing up in most polls because he's really relatively unknown, although when he came out, he got a kind of a blip, a push in his popularity for a period of time, and then it died out. The other major candidate is a man named Ciro Gomes, who is in the Brazilian Labor Party. And again, the Brazilian Labor Party is a party that has had a long tradition in Brazil. Ciro Gomes is not necessarily wed to that political party. In fact, he's been in 7 different political parties, party hopping from one to the next in order to remain powerful and important. He was the governor of the state in the northeast of Brazil, and he was a member of Lula's cabinet. So he's understood as being a kind of a hot-headed left-wing nationalist, but in this context of the elections, he's moved to the right and criticizes Lula in order to get Bolsonaro, people who supported Bolsonaro, to get their vote. So instead of maintaining a very clear left-wing nationalist discourse, he has actually been criticizing the left. Lula, in response, has been very, very careful not to counter those criticisms, saying, "Oh, we know Ciro Gomes, we understand he likes to, speak harshly, but we understand he's part of our family." And so in a way, he's been undercutting the strong attacks, and it's looking bad. Ciro Gomes refused to support Haddad in the last elections, and instead went to Paris and has said that he will not support the candidate of the left in this election. So he's really he's alienating a lot of people with his sectarianism. So there are a scattering of other candidates that will run, and there might be a third strong candidate in the third way. We really don't know. If Bolsonaro is impeached, then there is a possibility for the third way. There's a possibility that the media, the conservative media, and other forces will gather together to make an argument that Lula will bring radicalization of the country and bad economic policies, and therefore they need to support a candidate. But as I mentioned earlier, there has been no effort at this point for the big center, the Centrão, to do anything with the request for impeachment. Over 100 that have been filed in Congress. And in Brazil, the Speaker of the House, a man named Arthur Lira, who is of the Progressive Party, again, nothing to do with the ideology of the party, is a firm supporter of Bolsonaro, and until this point has refused to do anything to take seriously these impeachment requests. I think one of the reasons why Lira is not interested in doing this is, first of all, he has a lot of economic and political benefits by supporting Bolsonaro, who holds the string of the executive branch of the government, can give a lot of pork barrel benefits to his constituencies and his party. And so he's very reluctant to break until it's clear that he can have control over the new situation. Secondly, I think the right understands that they open a Pandora's box if they impeach Bolsonaro. All of a sudden, things become extremely unclear and very fluid, much like what happened when Dilma Rousseff was impeached. The very confusing situation developed out of that, and certain sectors lost control of the situation. So nevertheless, Brazilian politicians from the center-right have had no problem jumping ship when they realize that the political fortunes have shifted to the right, to the left, and could easily carry out the impeachment in order to strengthen another candidate who might be able to challenge Lula. So I mentioned earlier the current mobilizations. There had been mobilizations against Bolsonaro, the Fora Bolsonaro, Bolsonaro out of the government, that had occurred earlier in the year. They were relatively small, mostly because people were afraid to mobilize in the streets. It was a real concern about public health considerations. The government under Bolsonaro called for a big demonstration on September 7th and got his supporters out after 2 months of mobilizing them. And now there's been a united attempt by not only the left that has been clearly anti-Bolsonaro from the get-go, but also political parties of the center and the center-right to join forces. And so in the mobilizations that happened in early October, there were over 20 political parties that sent their support, even though some of them are playing a double game of, on one hand, supporting the Fora Bolsonaro, but on the other hand, not doing anything to break with him in Congress or pressuring for the actual impeachment. So everything is open. It's the sea, and so we don't really know what's going to happen. And that's one of the things that's exciting about Brazil Unfiltered, is I hope to really help you understand what's going on in the country. And we'll be doing a lot of interesting programming about that to dig deep into what's happening in all kinds of areas of Brazilian politics, culture, and society. We'll be interviewing key players in Brazilian politics over the course of this season. And we'll also be talking about many different things. I'm just going to throw out a couple of themes that we'll be discussing in no specific order. We're going to look at the history of Lula and who he was, who he is, what are the perspectives of a government under him. I'm going to try to explain the different forces of the Brazilian left. I want to talk a lot about the new social movements that have become important in this period, especially indigenous rights movement of indigenous people, the Black movement, which has become extremely vocal and important, the environmental movement, the LGBTQ movement, and other movements that have taken really a front seat and have been part of the mobilization against Bolsonaro. And all of this is to figure out where Brazil is headed. So that's all for now. Thanks for listening. Let me know if you have any comments or questions. I'll try to answer all of them. Please tell your friends about the program, and I'll see you in a week for more of Brazil Unfiltered. You can follow me on Instagram at James Naylor Green. That's James, NaylorGreen, or on Brazil Unfiltered at gmail.com, which is my email. Have a wonderful week. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.